right, here we go. It's the System Failure Podcast number 79. How are you this morning, Nate?
Hello, Brian. I am doing good this week. I guess I feel introspective these past couple of weeks. I am sure that I've already complained multiple times at the top of this August podcast about the cabin fever that sets in when you live in Maine and you get to the end of the long, dark winter. But today is the day the time change drives me nuts. I mean, I just can't believe, I don't care what time it is, but please, can we stop changing the time? But it's good news when you spring the clocks forward, which we have just this weekend, Brian. Because, well, first of all, it feels like you're getting out of work earlier.
Yeah, well, you're a mad lad and like losing an hour of your weekend time.
But yeah, that's true. With the spring forward, I didn't think of that. You do lose an hour of sleep Saturday to Sunday night, don't you?
I guess the good news is like your phones jump ahead, and so I didn't realize the time change had happened until I started looking at the oven clock and realizing what was going on. So that makes it a little easier, I guess. But I guess I just feel bad that my weekend is an hour less than it should be. But getting out of work is exciting.
Yeah. Well, you're right. A truncated weekend is indeed a tragedy, but it's only 1 hour, and it just means that we're getting back to some warm weather. Let's see. The other things that have been happening this week are, for the past 2 weeks, we've seen the markets slowly creep towards correction territory on Wall Street. I mean, all the excitement and much ballyhooed arrival of the Donald. It seems like the bloom is off the rose, and now there's some real consternation about what the ultimate implications of the Donalds and the Donald 2.0 are ultimately going to be. We'll have much more on that in the rest of the pod. But first, some very important news about our beloved Boston Bruins trading their captain Brad Marchand down to the Florida Panthers. So those three things: the cabin fever, the stock market, the malaise in the stock market, and the dealing of our beloved Brad Marchand from our Boston Bruins down to the hated Florida Panthers has really made they've really colored the past week or so, eh, Brian?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is nice that it is like March. It's like distinctly March now.
Yeah.
With the time jumping forward. Well, I mean, the Bruins traded, everyone's favorite Trent Frederick, who's a scrappy guy. Who I'll never forget him when he was trying to fight Ovechkin. But Ovechkin, that's like the grizzled veteran. But then he later speared Trent Frederick wildly in the groin.
I forgot about that. That was a couple seasons ago now. But yeah, Trent Frederick used to be very excitable. He would be out there shouting on the ice, and yeah, he was a fun player to watch. So
it was like a mini Brad Marchand.
Yeah.
And now, Brad Marchand, aka the Rat, has gone down to the place of the Rat. So I guess it's sort of fitting in a way.
Yeah.
And it'll be fun to watch him in the playoffs down there.
Well, the news out of Fort Myers is somewhat optimistic regarding the Red Sox, but and we can all be optimistic with Mike Vrabel leading Drake May and the Patriots down in Foxborough. But I mean, we haven't had a major sports championship in since 2019. I mean, it's really getting depressing around here in New England. I mean, it's like, come on, man.
We're supposed to win these things every year, basically.
Yeah, I don't get it. Like, the Bruins are horrible, but the Celtics are good, I guess. Oh, they won a title. So we have seen it.
Oh,
we did just have a title. I forgot. I don't watch a lot of basketball, but I know that for those people who watch sports all over the country are going to feel very bad for us up here in New England on our recently found, newly come upon hard times. So I know that we're engendering much sympathy on that front.
I guess I hope that maybe the price of Bruins tickets will go down and we can actually afford to go to a Bruins game for less than several $100s per ticket.
Well, for those not in the know, they're not going to be aware that the Bruins are owned by Montgomery Burns from The Simpsons. These guys called the Jacobs, like the Charlie Jacobs and Jeremy Jacobs. They're like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons meets Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. They're the ones that charge $17 for a beer at TD Garden, and I saw that they had jacked up ticket prices again this offseason despite the horrible performance on the ice.
Wow.
So I don't know. That's a good sign for ticket prices.
That's not going to hold on the secondhand market, I'm sure.
Hopefully, you're right.
Maybe we'll get down there for a reasonable price.
Yeah, maybe the Jacobses can be acquainted with the supply and demand of the market. So often the capitalists, those who own businesses, manage to socialize their losses while privatizing their gains. So maybe they can get a little taste of the cruel realities of the market with some violence on the secondhand exchanges, as you're saying there, Brian.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, We had major news. Let's see. We talked about President Zelensky's visit to the White House last week. So just addressing the chaos in the White House in general, and the continued cuts from Doge, and all of the consternation online about the second or third coming of Hitler. I don't know. It's like, is the Donald the next Hitler, or is he an agent of Moscow, or both? I'm not sure. Whatever it is, the invectives are being hurled online, just as strongly as they ever have been. But it does seem like the euphoria of the beginning of the Donald administration has kind of come and gone, and now we're looking at the stark reality, and it would seem in the past 2 weeks, the markets began seriously trying to grapple with some of the chaos and unpredictability of what the Donald's got going on there on Capitol Hill. So now, it's like, I have been thinking that we're going to have some kind of a massive market collapse for like 10 years now. So every time we get one of these correction territories, I've been burnt so many times thinking, here we go. We've got I remember in 2019, the repo market blew up and the yield curve was inverted and the stocks were going through massive sell-offs. And I was like, oh baby, here we go. And it eventually recovered. The Fed managed to fix the problem in the repo markets, and the valuations on Wall Street just kept creeping up. So I always wonder, I think that I think it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to have to face some kind of a market collapse at some point. So like I say, it's interesting to read the Wall Street Journal and get their take on where we are, in whether this is just a minor correction, where there's just blowing the fluff or the froth off of an overvalued market, or whether the fractional reserve banking system that constantly generates more dollars of debt than it does of actual currency has finally caught up to us, and we have to start admitting that debts are unpayable, right? And that's what we've been putting off since 2008, the admission that we have all these debts that are assets on the books of the rich, that are ultimately going to be unpayable. And in 2008, the banks didn't want to recognize this, and so they had the Federal Reserve buy that debt off of them at face value or near face value so that they wouldn't have to take such a write down on their balance sheets that they'd have to declare bankruptcy. We all remember that excitement from 2008. Yeah.
Well, there's going to be a narrative that, that Donald Trump is just incompetent and unable to manage the economy. But part of the challenge, not to sound like a MAGA diehard, is that we don't have a crazy distraction like a COVID thing or a wars in Ukraine, so you can blame everything on a Putin price hike. You have to face realities. Of course, Donald Trump is mixing it up crazy with all these tariffs and whatnot. And it's unclear how it's all going to shake out. But the fundamentals of our economy sure seem horrendous, especially just when you look at all the homeless people and how people can't afford houses, and it's impossible to get a job.
Yeah. The job market's cratered. The housing market's frozen, and there's this weird it's there's an inflation on, and the way to battle inflation is by jacking rates up. But there's also all this outstanding debt, most notably the federal debt, right? The federal deficit, the annual federal deficit piles up into this huge federal debt that goes up every year. And we've put ourselves in a position to pay the rich interest on their money versus just taxing it off them for free. Not only do we have to repay the money we've taken off the rich under this crazy scheme of ours, but we have to pay them interest for the pleasure of not taxing them. So we have this huge debt on, and then there's all the private debt markets, and if you jack up interest rates too much, all that debt becomes unaffordable, and now you have problems. But if you lower rates, now you have an inflation problem, right? Now prices start going up, and so it's the feds are really they really painted themselves into a corner here. But this is the same tune I was singing in 2019. Here it is, 2025. So I just there was an opinion piece about the market in this week's Wall Street Journal, and there's no groundbreaking revelations here, and they don't make a positive case for communism like last week's Wall Street Journal article of the week. But I thought that this article encapsulated the feeling of the moment.
So is this the system failure article of the week?
This is indeed, Brian, the system failure article of the week. This is an opinion piece, so you'll hear the author referring to themselves, like the reporter referring to themselves. So I don't usually I just stick to the regular reporting, but I like this one, so we'll go with it. And so I'm just going to read some excerpts here. So if it seems a little disjointed, that's why I didn't want to read the entire article. So here are just the parts that interested yours truly. Okay, the title of this piece is "Markets Finally Woke Up to Tariff Reality. Is this a buying opportunity?" And that's the headline, and the subtitle is "Your correspondent remains torn, but if you believe in the Trump pitch, now might be the time to take a swing." And so here's some of the meat of this article. For anyone who thought Trump's talk of deregulation and lower taxes would boost economic growth, this should be a great opportunity. The rest of the market has given up on the, quote, American exceptionalism trade. I have trouble turning bullish for the long run because I fear the new world order Trump is ushering in won't end well for investors. But in the short term, this feels like a very rapid sell-off that at least undoes much of my concern about the excess in markets. Investors have shifted from being super positive to focus instead on dangers. When sentiment turns sour, it is often a good time to pick up bargains. The risks to this view are threefold. First, prices haven't moved that much. U.S. stocks weren't cheap on November 5th and aren't cheap now. Stocks are still above 21 times estimated earnings for the market 12 months. Their dot-com era high 25 years ago was 25 times. It remains true that much of this high valuation is due to the heavy weight in the S&P of the Magnificent Seven: Amazon, Alphabet, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Nvidia, and Tesla. But if they plunge back to the lower valuations, they are so big they drag down the index as a whole. Second, the bad parts of Trump's agenda, tariffs in particular, are paralyzing business and scaring consumers. Economic data has weakened and come in below expectations, prompting the most recent leg down in stocks. If hiring and expansion plans are put on hold because of uncertainty about trade, weakness could spread. I don't know how to forecast this. We don't have experience of heavy tariffs on our closest trade partners being imposed, modified, and then largely deferred, then new tariffs threatened, all within a week. But I do know that confidence matters, and this isn't a good way of boosting animal spirits. The slowdown could just be the return to a reasonable, lower level of growth after the economy ran at an unsustainably fast pace last year. But if confidence suffers, it could be the start of something much worse. The markets have already started to prepare for a slower economy. Expectations for the Fed rate cuts this year have risen, and the 10-year Treasury yield has dropped fast. In stocks, my equal weight index of defensive sectors, least sensitive to the economy, is slightly up since the latest sell-off began in mid-February, while cyclicals exposed to economic growth are down 8%. Third, the good bits of Trump's agenda are also in question. Investors hope that as well as extending the 2017 tax cuts, a flurry of other tax cuts on tips, overtime, and Social Security payments would both transfer money from government to shareholders and stimulate the economy. Congress is still working out how to extend the tax cuts, but the proposal from the Republicans in the House includes $2 trillion of spending cuts, almost having the stimulatory effect of the $4.5 trillion tax extension. Exactly what will emerge from the reconciliation process remains unclear. Deregulation is being done with an axe rather than a scalpel. Trump has attempted to dismantle entire government agencies, leading to repeated legal setbacks. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency has focused on mass layoffs rather than productivity. Companies might see benefits eventually, but for now, they get more headlines about fired workers being rehired than about deregulation. Hopes for deregulation are alive in cryptocurrencies, where some of Trump's earliest directives have already taken effect, and banking, where Treasury has discussed cutting capital requirements. But both have reversed big parts of their post-election gains as markets fell, with Bitcoin down 18% from its December high, and bank stocks now only up 4% from the election, having risen as much as 19%. Investors who think the economy is merely going through a soft patch, that tax cuts will be big, and that the administration will manage worthwhile deregulation should be thinking about buying. All right, well, that's all I wanted to cover from that article. And they mentioned in that article the House budget proposal, which, despite all this excitement about DOGE and cuts to wasteful government spending, is going to, add $2 trillion to the deficit they're going to give $4.5 trillion in tax cuts to the rich over 10 years, compared to the only $2 trillion in savings that they're hoping to get from all these budget cuts. So it's never been about the deficit, right? This is about cutting taxes on the wealthy, and that's really the way that post World War II economics has. The article really shows the controversy of post-World War II economics. On the one hand, you have the Keynesians, whose big idea, Keynesianism comes from the two world wars and the Great Depression, where you boost demand and you boost economic growth with government spending. And then there's the other model, the neoliberal model, where you slash taxes on the rich and hope for a trickle-down effect to the rest of the economy, right? And that playbook it's deleterious to economic growth, right? When you're cutting government services, you're removing like welfare payments or SNAP benefits or whatever it is that you're cutting. You're removing that stuff from the economy, and you can see a brief boost in your GDP by selling off chunks of the government to private corporations. But obviously, the private corporations are only going to do that if they can extract a profit over and above whatever the government services were charging prior to privatization. Right. So, in the long run, when you privatize government services, like parking meters or buses or trains or what have you, you make things more expensive for consumers because the private entities are only going to buy those assets if they're going to, like I said, make them a profit. And so that profit just gets, these public-private partnerships become a way to remove even more money from the economy, and they ultimately lead to, they don't lead to economic stability at all, they lead to economic malaise, right? Have we seen great leaps in the economy, since the Reagan administration really signaled a sea change on this front from the old Keynesian paradigm into the new neoliberal paradigm supported by the Clintons and supported by by Republicans and Democrats since the 90s. It's quite a picture to see. And when we come back from the break, we're going to have some clips from Ian Carroll's recent appearance in the JRE, which fit into this idea as you hear them grappling with the history of our intelligence services, the history of America. The history of American intelligence services post-World War II, and that connection to the corporate apparatus that runs this country. So that'll be interesting. So now my voice is tired from all that reading, Brian. Any reactions from you on that somewhat admittedly dry article, but very interesting that the Wall Street Journal has us once again hanging at this weird inflection point, trying to figure out if the Donald's tariffs or if his tax cuts are going to indeed spur the economic growth we so desperately need because of the way that our economy is structured.
I guess I don't know. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I mean, obviously it's awfully early.
Yeah.
Like what privatization? I mean, they're like getting rid of the Department of Schools. Or they put
Department of Education.
They put that McMahon, the WWII lady in charge.
What is her name? Oh,
it's like Cynthia or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know if the Department of Education's actually a good thing. I mean, it sounds like a good thing, but I guess what I've seen, Matt Taibbi was reporting on this. I saw that it seems like it mostly hasn't been very good, but it's hard to be sure. Man, privatization is going to increase costs. Well, I mean, there is LASIK surgery when it was covered by insurance companies cost $1 bazillion, and now that insurance doesn't cover LASIK surgery, it's $1,000.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
But that is kind of that's not really privatization. Yeah. That's removing insurance companies from the matter and
it's already privatized. You've got this weird middleman who has established a toll booth, right? The insurance companies, they're not laser in anyone's eyes, they're just shuffling papers. And so that's really, we've got so many rent seekers that our government isn't controlled by rent seekers, and so they're always looking to increase the amount they can extract via rent and decrease the amount they have to pay out in taxes, and it's just enriching a small minority of our population, the rent seekers. The way that you stimulate economic growth is by building bridges that facilitate commerce, right? Not dropping taxes on the wealthy to blow up a huge wealth disparity. Right? The economy is a circulatory system. It's like blood flowing through a body, or like water moving through the water cycle. If the economy is if rainwater falls on the mountains and creates those mountain streams that merge into rivers, that flow into lakes, that flow into even bigger rivers that eventually flow out to sea, where that same water is then evaporated by the sun and rises into the atmosphere as clouds, blows over the land, and condenses as rain over the mountain streams, and the water cycle begins anew. That's the same with the way that money flows around the economy. The issue is that we have money pooling up in one part of the body and other parts of the body that are starved for blood. Now, there's or starved for water. I'm mixing my metaphors here. And the Keynesian idea was that, well, you just simply take blood from where it's pooling up uselessly and apply it to where it is sorely needed, and that's the way you keep that circulatory system flowing, right? Capitalism is flawed in that it creates these imbalances, and the idea is that you would then compensate for those imbalances with Keynesian economic policy as a way of extending the runway of capitalism so it doesn't collapse. Right? This was explicitly what FDR was thinking when he implemented the New Deal. He wrote in his diary that we're saving the system of private capital from itself here. If we, the FDR administration, was an enemy of capitalism, we have only to watch it collapse the way it did in the Soviet Union the decade before. So anyway,
so I guess, like, obviously our system has these systemic issues, and so I mean, maybe like Donald Trump will come in and like finish it off, which would be like a good thing, or maybe he'll make some changes that make the system more viable. So I guess maybe either way, it's exciting. I don't know. I have a hard time not being optimistic about the future, just because it seems like, this system of, I don't know, tax cuts for the rich and going to war have been what it's been for several decades now. And so, I mean, at least it seems like we're trying to end wars, but I guess we're still trying to do tax cuts for the rich. I don't know. I just think of like our ruling people as like wildly incompetent or inbred or just completely out of line with what people need. I don't know. It's hard. I don't really start thinking the system's going to collapse unless I'm smoking weed on the podcast, which we haven't done in many episodes.
We'll consider that to be a harbinger of doom. Huh? Brian's back on the bud.
So I don't know. I mean, it's hard not to believe in the fundamentals of America, just because like there's like just the per capita intelligence of people and our ability to work and the resources we have. There's so much opportunity that it's just hard to imagine things being held down for too long. Like, I mean, if things get finished off, well, there's just so much abundance of resources and just like in the land and in the people. And it seems like there's a lot of opportunity, I guess. Although maybe we've all been drinking too much Mountain Dew, and so we don't have it anymore. Or I don't know. I guess I don't know. It's hard to imagine how it's all going to play out. But it is like awfully early in the administration to like being like, well, this is a failure, and we need to reinvite our neoliberal reptilian overlords, give them power again, and we need to like not like succumb so quickly. But I mean, if the Donald Trump and Elon Musk administration's a disaster, we need to not like have Hillary Clinton like usher her back in.
So I like what you said there. I agree with it. I to me, there's two ways. I have great hope because it feels like the Democratic Party definitely got smacked with a heavy rebuke, and I have great hope that they may look. Rich people they're allowed to petition their government. There should be a party that is out there advocating for tax cuts. Right? We just need it to be counterbalanced by an actual party with an actual alternative vision, right? And since the Clinton administration, the Democrats have been wholly corrupt. With the collapse of labor unions, the old base of Democratic power under the Reagan administration, the Clintons were looking for new fundraising sources. And the American Leadership Council, I think that's what they called their little organization, which was really about funding the Democratic Party with corporate donations instead of donations from the union. So, like, the fact that the Democrats have got such a stern rebuke, it may be the case that they have no choice but to return to some of the populist policies, or at least they could pivot to non-neoliberal. But at least we could go back to Keynesianism. That's really what Bernie Sanders advocates for, right? Raise taxes on the rich and use that to keep the money flowing around the economy, as opposed to sequestered amongst one small minority. So there is hope in the sense that, like, maybe the Dems will be forced to just be the good cop again, which would be awesome. And there's also what you just outlined, the accelerationist view, where Like if we can, like the final ripping the scab off, right? The final collapse of the heavily indebted capitalist system. Well, I see that as like a good thing. So I don't know whether it's democratic redemption or the final disgrace of the Republicans. I see a silver lining in both of those dark clouds, eh? Yeah.
Well, I guess what needs to happen, I won't start to panic until like there's some kind of boots on the ground reality. Like I guess the price of eggs is going up, although I just get mine at Trader Joe's, and so it hasn't changed. But I guess this whole avian flu hype thing has somehow jacked up the price of eggs or whatever. But I mean, I haven't really. Like, I remember when, I don't know, like, the price of limes went from, like, 25 cents or whatever. They become some insane amount, like, after the COVID years or whatever. There was, like, crazy inflation going on, and that was shocking. Yeah. And so we're not really seeing that. It's just people's, like, 401ks and stock portfolios are hemorrhaging value right now. And I don't know. I don't really worry about that. I mean, I guess I have a 401k, but I'd never look at it.
Yeah. I agree with you. I feel like the stock market collapse will be the last thing that happens, right? It's not going to be a leading indicator. It's going to be a lagging indicator. So that's why I feel like we're not looking at the final collapse here in March of 2025. Much as that would amuse yours truly, I think this will just be a correction and we'll move on. And we'll wait for the real crisis of capitalism that we have been putting off since 2008. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, probably more than like tariffs altering the landscape of our economy. Like we should be worried about like what's going to happen with AI and whatnot. Yeah. So yeah, I guess I'm not worried. I guess I'm really not worried about what's going on in the stock market. But we'll see though. Yeah.
Yes, we'll keep our eye on the ball here on the Old System Failure podcast, Brian.
So I mean, I guess what's your feel? Are you like predicting a collapse imminently here? Or
no,
what's going on?
Well, I mean, my collapse predictions are like as old as 2017, 18, and 19. So I feel like my credibility is totally shot here. But this does not feel like the collapse to me. As mentioned, I would expect to see other things happening in real time, and then the stock market collapse be like the last thing that happens. So I don't think this is the collapse yet. But it's interesting to see the country collectively pausing, trying to figure out where we are in our trajectory, and kicking the tires on what's going on in the Donald administration and whatnot. It does feel like we're at quite like the things could go. Things could either improve or they can improve dramatically, or they could deteriorate dramatically from here. So it's interesting to sense that we're all at this inflection point here in the early going of the Donald 2.0.
Yeah, well, I guess like in the same way that like the time change kind of ends, like it marks the end of winter, and we're kind of it's the end of unbridled Trump optimism or something.
Yeah,
and so now it's like the brass tacks figuring out what the reality of the situation is.
Yeah. Yes. Well, Brian, I propose you and I take a short break, and when we come back, we'll fire up enough of this to dispense with this dry economics talk. We're going to fire up some juicy conspiracy theories with Mr. Ian Carroll and his recent appearance in the JRE. Got a couple of fun clips for that for y'all. After the break, stay tuned. And we're back. Alrighty, Brian. Well, this week's System Failure podcast of the week is, of course, as mentioned at the top of the pod, Mr. Ian Carroll, the TikTok conspiracy theorist researcher.
Yeah, well, this was like a barn burner.
Yeah.
Well, I had to go on the Joe Rogan subreddit just to see what they were saying.
Oh, well, all right.
And they were saying that they like weren't going to talk about like I don't know, like Israel or whatever.
Sorry, Carroll and Rogan were saying this? They wouldn't talk about Israel?
No, like on the subreddit, there's
okay, yeah.
As though like Joe Rogan like not willing to confront this issue. But of course they went in depth on the issue.
Yeah.
And they basically got into a Jewish space lasers.
Well, I didn't clip any of the parts of the episode involving Judaism, but it's something we've talked about many times on this pod, and even brought up with the August Dr. Michael Hudson, who took a very dim view of anti-Semitic ideas throughout history, as you may recall.
Well, just in short, they just talked about how like Epstein and like Mossad are obviously tied together, and like famously Giselle Maxwell.
Yes, yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell, Ghislaine. I don't know how to pronounce her name.
Her dad is a Mossad agent. There's
Yes.
just like no question about it. And like all this like Leslie Wexner or whatever,
Yeah.
and all this stuff, like it ties into this crazy intelligence operation. And it's not that like Jews are bad people or anything like that. It's just that like parts of the U.S. government there's problems with, and they're just saying the same thing, that there's like parts of the government over there don't respond to the people. And of course we have quoted the Times of Israel articles like talking about how like Netanyahu is like trying to keep the war going over there. And so obviously we love Jews on this podcast. We have problems with intelligence agencies or parts of them doing subversive things.
It's really, man, when you start talking about the excesses of the Israeli government or of finance in general, you have to issue that disclaimer. Like, we really want to separate this from Jewish people, generally speaking. Like, there's every group has, sinister people as a part of their group. So if we talk about sinister people who happen to be Jewish, we're not like wanting to paint the entire, like, this is a tiny minority. We're literally talking about an Israeli government who Israeli people themselves had a major problem with. You may recall that country was torn apart by protests in the lead up to October 7th, right? So this is what we're talking about.
And like, for better or for worse, I mean, the zeitgeist has really moved on this after October 7th, where, I mean, obviously, we don't want terrorist acts committed on like Israeli people, but I mean, we also don't want Palestinian children being buried under piles of rubble. And so, I mean, I think that probably our listeners, understand where we're coming from.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, I didn't clip any of the parts mentioning Judaism, but I have clipped the parts about the beginnings, the origins of our intelligence services and their liaison with corporate power, which I think tells the story. And as we play these clips, it would be my wish for our intrepid system failure listeners to keep in mind that the background, and this is something lost on Rogan and Carroll, so that's why I want to have everyone keep in the back of their minds. World War II was really an inflection point we had, after the Great Depression and the New Deal, we really implemented Keynesian-style policies, and our elite class, like the aristocracy here in the United States, has been working to undo the New Deal and Keynesian economics in general since World War II, and the intelligence services are a key part of that effort.
So should we dive into this clip, or
Yes,
is there any other preamble?
I think that's all for preamble, Brian. If we could fire up clip number 1. This clip will talk about the origins of the CIA and some of its early actions in Guatemala. Very interesting.
And the people that founded those intelligence agencies, like Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, they were corporate lawyers. And can I just keep going on this? Because this is like...
Keep going.
Let them cook. This is the thing that blew my mind, right? Is I was trying to research GameStop and shit. And then I started to realize that there's this whole monstrosity that is an official part of our government, these intelligence agencies, that when you really learn their history and read about their official history, let alone their history that sort of is still secret, it is very clear that they've been off the rails right from the start. And that's true inside of every, like, whether you're reading Legacy of Ashes and The Devil's Chessboard, very well researched official books about this shit, or if you're doing internet research. And the reason why you'd start an intelligence agency using a corporate lawyer instead of like a doctor or a military guy or something is because a corporate lawyer is already familiar with all of the big CEOs of all the big corporations, right? Alan Dulles worked at Sullivan and Cromwell as a lawyer. And so he was very familiar with IG Farben producing Zyklon B for the Nazis. He was familiar with Standard Oil. He was familiar with shipping companies and fruit companies and all these companies all around the world. And he's got good connections with them all. And so you hire one guy, Alan Dulles, and you have just hired an entire network of multinational corporations theoretically to work on behalf of the U.S. But when you read the histories and you read what Alan Dulles was saying behind closed doors and everything, what he was doing is he was hiring the U.S. government in order to fund a corporate slush fund for corporations to utilize this power, this newly government-bestowed power, to essentially wage violence that is sanctioned. Because, you see what I'm saying? Yeah. Because all those corporations, the perfect example is Guatemala. United Fruit Company had bought up all this land in Guatemala and was growing bananas like crazy. And a lot of the land was just sitting vacant. And Jacobo Arbenz comes into power, and he's like, this is bullshit. There's this American corporation that's owning all of our land, that's making all of us poor, and they're not even using a bunch of this land. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy back the land. He didn't take it. He bought it back from the United Fruit Company, and he was going to distribute it for free to all the farmers that were destitute, which is like socialist, kind of, but it's also pretty badass to use like your government money to buy all your farmers' land from this multinational corporation. But that pissed United Fruit off. And this is right as the CIA was getting founded, and United Fruit was a client of Sullivan and Cromwell. And Allen Dulles was a lawyer there, right? So United Fruit goes to Allen Dulles. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was the Secretary of State. Yeah, Secretary of State. So these two brothers that are both lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell are the director. Well, technically Allen Dulles was not yet the director of CIA, but he was like the founder. He just had a beef with Truman and with the first couple leaderships of the president there. And so United Fruit goes to them and is like, hey, can we overthrow this piece of shit? Because he's fucking with our business, right? So this is like how corporations wanted this government-sanctioned power. And they, through those two brothers, lobbied the United States, propagandized the United States. They hired propaganda artists to propagandize them. And they painted him as a communist right at our doorstep. And then the CIA went in and through a series of kind of somewhat botched attempts called PB Success and Operation Success and Operation PB Success, they overthrew the government of Guatemala and they ousted him. They bombed Guatemala City and they got rid of him and they put in their own dictator that started 30 years of absolute devastation and like military rule and just death marked, like really dark shit that basically tore Guatemala apart on behalf of United Fruit. They did the same thing in Iran like 3 years later with Kermit Roosevelt, where it became this thing where these multinational corporations that are affiliated with this intelligence agency, just kind of through friendships and through partnerships and through the network, they started to utilize Allen Dulles and the CIA in general on their behalf to do things for the corporate interest because they are the power players in this world. They always have been the power players in this world. And they had been itching for quite some time to get that government-sanctioned ability to wage violence against anyone around the world. And we've been doing that ever since, using the intelligence agencies on behalf of the corporate blob, which is not always distinguishable from organized crime, and just going off and whacking people and overthrowing governments and starting coups, like right to this day, to like Ukraine 2014.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the clip is like super on point. Yeah. But you think, well, I guess what's your because it's super on point, but you think they're missing something, or? Well,
we'll get to what they're missing at the end of the next clip here.
Okay,
I'll talk more about that. For now, I just want our listeners to notice two things. One, notice how this whole thing is. Notice how tied in corporate interests are to this clandestine use of government power. Right? That's what Ian Carroll was just describing at the end there. That Allen Dulles was a corporate lawyer. Really, the guy that founded the CIA really tells you everything that you need to know about what's happening here.
Well, it's a good point about security. Just elsewhere in the podcast, making the point about how like the CIA was supposed to be like a newspaper for like Herbert Hoover or Eisenhower or Truman.
This was Truman's. This is why Truman clashed with the Dulles brothers, because he wanted the CIA to be a newspaper that only the president read, not blowing up people's regimes and calling them communists. Yeah, and that's really the second thing that the big takeaway from this clip. Like, just notice how important the demonization of Marxism or socialism or communism is to getting to getting public support for these kind of overthrows, like the one of Jacobo Arbenz we just heard about. Right. And the point here is that World War II was this cataclysm. Like, millions of people died, and the international community got together and built a sort of new world order that wasn't based on military conquest, right? It was based on quote unquote democracy, and that's really meant that because we've outlawed military conquests like the one that Putin's involved in, because that's generally outlawed. It is propaganda. Like the battlefield is now the hearts and minds, right? It's really a propaganda battle that we've been locked in. That's what World War II is, right? A propaganda war with the Soviet Union that we've been locked in. And that clip really shows how useful a tool the demonization of Marxism is.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, you said World War II is a propaganda war, but sort of like the Cold War is our propaganda war with...
Yeah, I meant to say the Cold War. Okay. I may have misspoken, but yeah, you can see the difference. Like, World War II is a propaganda... I am misspeaking. World War II is a kinetic war, and the Cold War is a propaganda war, and you can really see the shift there to trying to fool people or trying to get one over on people. by fooling them or by giving them junk economics or what have you, versus going to Guatemala and like physically taking the land back and giving it to the United Fruit Company. We're going to try to drum support in the homeland by convincing people that Arbenz is some kind of a communist. When what he's really doing is just, he's trying to get money to his own people and not send it to this American corporation that's in there, that's the Chiquita banana that's in there.
Well, when I try to explain the system failure podcast to people, like the point I make is just like, well, Marxism should not be a bad word. And like, if like communism is so terrible, like why do we have to keep on throwing these populist uprisings in Central American countries?
Yes,
And this is a great point. Like, well, they demonized communism, I guess is how they did it, so that these corporate interests through dullists there can go through and do this terrible thing.
Yes. That's about it.
It's very convenient.
Yeah.
And we need to change our opinion about Marxism so that we can have the kind of economic change here in 2025 that is long overdue, eh?
Yeah. Again, the idea isn't that we just think Marx is right about everything. It's just that his analysis has real value. We just need to engage with it as mature adults and not as propagandized children.
I mean, this idea that we just can't consider Marxism, it's just so like insane. It's the propaganda is just so far-reaching into everyone's brain, and you start talking about Marx, and everyone starts freaking out, man.
Yeah, it's like reading from the Black Bible or whatever, the Devil's Bible. It's really, it is kind of against our state religion here in America to take seriously some of the criticisms Karl Marx had. Yeah. And in the next clip we're about to play with Mr. Eric Carroll, again talking about one of our favorite bailiwicks here on the System Failure podcast, which would be, of course, 4-star General Smedley Butler in the business plot of the 1930s. And it really shows what kind of state the world was in. I already mentioned FDR's private diary and the Russian Revolution that roiled politics in 1917. This next clip about Smedley Butler really shows the state of the class war in America during the 1930s. So, Brian, why don't we fire up clip number 2? Getting back to how neither Carroll nor Rogan seem to have any. They're able to see everything. They're able to see that the CIA is a corrupt arm of corporate America, but they're not able to. They have no contact with the Marxist, critique of capitalism. So they have no. At the end of this clip, I left it. I had it edited out and I put it back, just where Rogan at the end suggests that Doge is going to be the solution to these problems. Like just cutting government spending is going to be the solution to these problems. So just appreciate with humor the fact that Mr. Rogan is suggesting Doge at the end of this clip, which is very funny to me.
Did you ever read Smedley Butler's War is a Racket?
Oh yeah, dude.
So that was 1933. So in 1933, it was still going on like that, and he was waking up to it as he was leaving his military career.
Do you know about the business plot, Jamie? About what they tried to do with him?
No. Oh, yes, I do. He wanted to take over the country.
No, he saved the country from it.
But not that he wanted
all the
to.
Industrialists
they wanted him to be a part of.
There's almost
over the
a Nazi coup in the 30s where we almost got taken over by our own military and became Nazis because Prescott Bush and a bunch of his other buddies were on Team Nazi, and it's because they were all funding the Nazis and they wanted us on that team.
And they tried to recruit Smedley Butler to be the lead of this.
Yep.
And take over the country.
I suspect, I'm always kind of forming my understanding research by research, but I suspect that it was World War I where they realized how much power you can have if you're funding both sides of a war.
Look at this quote. I spent 33 years in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Smedley Butler, 1935.
He was one of the most decorated Marines, or was he in the Army, of all time? General?
Unfucking believable.
Yeah, War is a Racket is a relatively short book that anyone can buy online, and I highly recommend it to everyone. That paired with...
but that's was so wild that was 33.
Oh, yeah, and it's still going on to this day.
And the general public hasn't even had a whisper of this. Like the average normie, probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
Yep.
Like, when did this start making it into the zeitgeist? Obviously in films.
I think when Elon bought Twitter.
Right.
And it's still not making it into the mainstream zeitgeist, but and you've played a big part in this too, this whole decentralized media space. As technology naturally walks forward, I think that we're living in this world where all these rich people, all these evil, controlling sickos of varying degrees. They come from a world where they could control everything. They could control the newspapers. They could buy out the press. They could pay for journalists.
Yes.
And that strategy walked itself into technology. And suddenly technology is just naturally walking forwards. And this just changes the game. Like, you can't use those old strategies when you have a phone and internet and social media. And we're watching the cognitive sort of breakdown of their old ways that they don't know how to adapt. And it's just scheme after scheme after scheme is crumbling.
Right.
And the secret is just free speech. That's all you need is free speech and communication on the internet.
And Doge.
All right, I didn't get Rogan quite saying and Doge there, but that was his solution. I really like how they're talking about the internet as a real catalyst for change here. It makes me think of the power of the bound book, versus a scroll, which is inconvenient and you can't bookmark a scroll. The advent of the bound book was a huge part of why Christianity was successful in seizing power as the Roman Empire collapsed and sank like a leaky ship without a trace. And then, of course, when the resulting Catholic Church, who took power, evolved into a moribund authority of its own during the Middle Ages and had to be revolted against, the printing press played a huge role in that. So it's like these big changes in communication technology seem to come around at the end of dying empires, or as an important part of the populace waking up and realizing the true nature of the empire in which they're living. And so it's fascinating to me that the internet is the technology that is quintessential to the collapse of the American empire, in the way that the printing press was quintessential to the collapse of the medieval church and medieval authority, and to the way the bound book was integral to the collapse of Roman authority during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And we'll come back to technology in a second, but just appreciate here how interesting things were in the 1930s. Like this state of affairs where the rich try to instigate a coup against FDR to remove him and undo the New Deal to preserve their own fortunes. Right? You can just the failure of that and the rise of the middle class with World War II really was it's the signature moment, the arrival of the American middle class, that made the current version of America what it is today. It's like World War II is this blind corner that people can't see around. Like, everything changed with World War II. We were on this positive trajectory before it, and since then, the same positive trajectory that yielded the American middle class has been rolled back slowly, bit by bit. In a war of information. Right, one of the first empires striking back was the women's lib movement of the early 1970s. Right, now obviously there's a real problem when half the population goes to work and the other population stays home and supports that work with crucial economic labor, but their share of the national income comes through their husband as a conduit. Right now, that's a situation ripe for abuse. And rather than tackling that in some constructive way, we created a propaganda campaign, Operation Mockingbird, where CIA employees are embedded in the media. People like Gloria Steinem encouraged a situation where both parents go to work, right? Thereby doubling the supply of labor in the labor market and driving down wages. And now we live in a world where every house has to be a 2-income house. You can't have just one person earning enough money for an entire household anymore. Now, that's a huge that's a huge transfer of wealth. The ultimate result of women's lib is this huge transfer of wealth from regular people to the rich. At that same time, also communication technology improved to the point where you could actually coordinate the offshoring of factories in foreign countries with cheap labor like China. And so that was the 1970s was the era of sending women to work without any thought to the impact that doing that would have on the labor market. And it was a period of offshoring where American labor collapsed and the labor unions collapsed. The political power of the labor unions dissolved. And then you had Reagan, the rise of Reagan and neoliberal economics in the 80s, which ultimately culminated in the 2008 financial collapse. And here we are, with the zombie economy, printing money to buy debts that can't ever be paid, and just waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah, and wages are low, and you can't afford to buy a house. Yeah, but and just also so the CIA obviously wasn't a thing in 1933 or whenever when the Prescott Bush thing happens, and then the post World War II era, the CIA gains power, and then you have situations like in Guatemala that they just described, and then you've also got this force at work inside the United States, not just in other countries. And and so you have like your Gloria Steinem, women's lib movement, which obviously there's things about women's liberation that are great.
Yeah, they addressed a real problem with a fake solution that impoverished us all. That's what happened with women's lib.
Yeah.
Well, look, if the New Deal era is A New Hope and the post-World War II era is The Empire Strikes Back, when does Return of the Jedi start? And the answer to that seems pretty obvious to me. Because of the internet, this sector, right, completely you can't control media the way you could in the 70s with the Gloria Steinem thing. And that became obvious with Brexit and with the rise of the Donald in the mid-2010s, right after the 2008 financial collapse. Because of the internet, you had the intelligence services lost the ability to. They lost control over the flow of information. Right? They lost their monopoly on information, just like the Catholic Church lost their monopoly of information with Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in 1411. I believe that's the right date. You have to check me on that. So it's wicked interesting to see how communication technology affects the rise and fall of empires, and specifically the capitalist trajectory that we find ourselves mired in this very moment.
Wicked indeed.
Yeah.
Well, you were saying it's like this neoliberal thing earlier to kind of give tax cuts to the rich, but I love this idea that the Bushes are Nazis.
Yeah.
And if you're like a young person, if you're like very young, you were born after 9/11, lots of people happened. But I remember what 9/11 was like, and it was just this crazy. After 9/11 was a crazy power consolidation by the government that we used to do all kinds of terrible things. And the forces of evil were being enacted like through the Republican Party back then. And things to like, Dick Cheney, a truly odious figure. And now it's like the left who's like advocating for these crazy wars and foreign entanglements and whatnot. It's like really crazy. I don't know. Like, there's this idea that like Germany lost World War II, but the Nazis won because it's like Operation Paperclip, right? Yeah. It's where we bring in like all the Nazis into
tens of thousands of Nazi engineers. No, it wasn't like a couple, 3 guys. It was like the Soviets and the Americans split up all the people that knew anything in Nazi Germany and brought them over to their side.
Yeah, well, and just going back to like the CIA gaining power. You see like JFK getting killed for trying to like end this war in Vietnam, basically.
Yeah,
and it's just really wild. And now, like finally, like in 2020 or so, like information is gaining enough power that we aren't just at the mercy of our reptilian overlords.
I forgot to weave the JFK narrative the JFK story into my narrative. I'm really glad you brought that up because that's a crucial part of the post-World War II history, and I just totally glazed over it. So good call on that one, Brian. And when I read my Will and Ariel Durant history of Rome, it really just reads the aristocracy just got one over on the working class every single time, right? The working class wanted to have a strike. They all left. They did this multiple times, the secession of the plebes, and the rich were like, all right, come back to work, but we'll give you a political office, the tribune of the plebes, and when you can use that, and that will mollify the crowd. And then they just totally neutered the office. And then when some of those tribunes of the plebe, notoriously the Gracchus brothers, actually tried to implement some kind of reform for relief of the poor, they had those guys killed in public. And that was really one of the major catalysts of the Civil War that saw Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon and seize power in Rome. That was really the assassination of the Gracchi brothers, the 2 famed tribune of the plebes who, like I say, tried to actually improve a lot in the poor. Being publicly murdered was really the realization that there was never going to be any relief, and as it turned out, only having a strongman emperor was just the only way that society could continue forward at all. And it teetered around for a couple, 300 years before finally, collapsing, as we described at the top of the pod. So, yeah, I just noticed that this time around, the aristocracy is not getting everything their own way, right? They get hit with a New Deal, right? They get hit, or Smedley Butler blows the whistle on them in the business plot, or JFK tries to withdraw from Vietnam, or implement Order 0 or Order 00. What was that order to get rid of the Federal Reserves? He had some legislation upcoming at the time of the assassination also. But mostly, right, he didn't bend the knee to the intelligence services. They told him we're doing this Bay of Pigs. He didn't want to go along with it, and when he found out that they were doing it anyway, he canceled the air support, causing a disaster, and it was war between the intelligence services and the executive after that, and we all know the result as you so conveniently pointed out there, Brian. So, yeah, I would like to think, I have this great hope that we will not follow the Romans down their path, and instead we'll be able to switch gears here, this time around, and hopefully retire our empire in a way that's constructive for the citizens of this country and not horribly destructive. But we'll see. All that remains to be seen.
Well, there's all this skepticism about Joe Rogan among a lot of people. He has Elon Musk on and Donald Trump on, and so I think maybe there's a perception that he's some kind of lap boy for those forces.
Well, he's friends with Elon, right? Of course he's going to be cheerleading Doge.
Well, I guess I have a lot of belief that Joe Rogan cares about the truth more than having Donald Trump and Elon Musk on the podcast. And so it's up to you, dear system failure listener, to listen to the podcast and spread the message so that we can get Nate here on the Joe Rogan pod to spread the good word about Karl Marx.
Well, maybe that'll happen someday. But in the meantime, maybe Rogan could get Richard Wolff or Michael Hudson or some of these people that he just hasn't quite read the right books yet because of our weird taboo against Marxist thought. That's got to be the bulwark keeping Rogan from realizing that implementing tariffs and slashing government spending but also slashing taxes on the rich even more is no way to get back to the kind of economic growth we had in the post-World War II era when we had a middle class. Obviously, cutting taxes on the rich and cutting spending, as Reagan did, is no way to achieve economic growth. You get a little burst in the near term, but in the long term, it removes more and more money from the economy and sequesters it away in the bank accounts of the already wealthy. Right? We've already said it all in this pod, Brian, but the solutions are just so obvious if you can just embrace a little bit of open-mindedness. That's the way it looks from here, anyway.
All right, cool.
All right, Brian. Well, I think this is usually the moment when I beseech our intrepid system failure audience to head on over to systemfailure.org. There you can read the weekly essays written by yours truly. You'll also get those essays, of course, on Thursday. I'll do an audio read, but you won't be able to see the pictures or also see the further materials. And this week's essay has got a lot of wicked, scintillating further materials. It's going to be on Eleusis, that's tried and true subject. So you can find that at systemfailure.org. Or if you want to get in touch with Brian or myself, you can accomplish that tidy feat over at systemfailure.org as well. We hope to see you all online this week. Have a great week for yourself, folks. Take care.
All right, bye.